Genesis 5 is one of the most overlooked chapters in the Bible because most people read it and immediately think, why were these people living for 900 years, almost 1,000 years? Did humans really live that long? And if they did, then what happened to our lifespan? And over the years, people have tried to explain it in many ways. Some say humans physically lived longer before the fall. Others say DNA was more pure in ancient times. Some point to David saying man's years are now shorter. Others say evolution and genetics slowly reduce human lifespan over time. But if we stop and think logically, even with modern medicine, science, and understanding, living nearly 1,000 years physically does not align naturally with the reality of the human body as we know it. So what if Genesis 5 is not primarily trying to teach us biology, ancient genetics, or physical longevity? What if these years are symbolic language, speaking about cycles of consciousness, stages of awareness, development of identity, and the evolution of the inner human experience? Because if Jesus says the kingdom of God is within you, and Paul says Christ in you, and also says you are the temple of God, then Genesis 5 must be revealing something happening within you. So tonight, we are going to read Genesis 5 differently, not as a random genealogy, but as a map of consciousness, a progression of awareness, and the journey from fragmentation to integration to rest. And once you see the pattern, the chapter that once felt repetitive, confusing, and impossible will suddenly become coherent, practical, and deeply transformative. Because Genesis 5 is not merely asking how long did they live. It is asking, what kind of consciousness are you living from? So, let's begin. Genesis 5:1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him. So we'll take it line by line. This is the book. A book in scripture is not always a physical book. It represents a record, a pattern, or a revelation being unfolded. Next line, the generations of Adam. Most people read generations as biological descendants only. But in this context, generations represent stages, expressions, and development of consciousness and identity. This verse is saying, this is the unfolding pattern of human awareness and identity. Next line, in the day that God created man. God represents ultimate truth, higher awareness, the source or inner knowing. Man, Adam, represents conscious awareness, the choosing self. So this is about the emergence of conscious awareness. Next, in the likeness of God made he him. This is very deep. Likeness refers to reflection or resemblance or nature. So this is saying conscious awareness was designed to reflect truth itself. Human awareness was originally designed to operate in alignment with truth, clarity, and higher consciousness. Let's look at some examples. In career, what this looks like. Before, you had insecurity, competition, and ego-driven behavior. But this verse reminds you, your original design was not fear-based striving. Next is in the likeness of God. This is saying, you were meant to create consciously, collaborate wisely, and operate from clarity instead of insecurity. Practical example. A person aligned with this understanding doesn't need to sabotage others to feel valuable, doesn't build identity only from titles, and works from inner confidence instead of constant comparison. Relationship example, what this looks like. Many relationships operate from fear, insecurity, and control. But this verse reminds you, your original design was alignment, not fear. In the likeness of God, meaning you were meant to love consciously, communicate truthfully, and relate from wholeness instead of lack. Practical example. A person living from alignment does not weaponize love, does not control through fear, and does not need constant validation to feel worthy. Religion example. What this looks like. People often live disconnected from themselves. They often operate from shame or fear. But this verse reminds you, your original state was not separation. In the likeness of God, meaning you were designed for awareness, truth, and conscious alignment. Practical example. When you pause before reacting, choose awareness over impulse, and act from truth within, you are reflecting that likeness. The core revelation. This verse reveals your deepest nature is not chaos, but alignment. Why this matters before the genealogy? Because Genesis 5 is about to show what happens to awareness over time. how patterns develop, and how identity unfolds through generations. And before the journey begins, scripture reminds you this was your original design. So now we understand. Genesis 5 is not merely listing names, it is tracing the journey of consciousness. And the first thing it tells you is this: you were made in likeness, you were designed for alignment, and truth is already within your blueprint. Which means, no matter how far awareness drifts, alignment is still your deepest nature. Verse 2: male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam in the day when they were created. First, notice something shocking. It does not say called his name Adam. It says called their name Adam. Why this matters? This reveals Adam represents a unified human consciousness. Next is male and female. What does this mean? Male represents awareness, direction, conscious choice, and the initiating principle. Female represents creativity, receptivity, emotional and imaginative realm, and nurturing principle. This is saying human consciousness was designed with both awareness and creativity working together in harmony. Next, and bless them. Blessing is not merely money or possessions. It means empowerment, harmony, and alignment with purpose. Meaning, when awareness and creativity are aligned, life flows naturally. Next, called their name Adam. This is very deep. It reveals before division, the human experience was whole, not male versus female, not logic versus emotion, not awareness versus creativity, but integrated consciousness. This verse is saying human consciousness was created as a unified whole where awareness and creativity work together in alignment. Career example, what this looks like. Many people operate from imbalance, logic without empathy, ambition without awareness, and creativity without discipline. Male and female created he them. A healthy career state is awareness plus creativity working together. This is strategic thinking, the male, and innovation and intuition, the female. It's not about gender. Practical example: someone aligned knows how to lead, but also how to listen, knows how to execute, but also how to create and adapt. That is integrated Adam. Relationship example, what this looks like. Many relationships struggle because one side dominates, so balance is lost. Male and female, this reveals healthy relationships require awareness, emotional intelligence, communication, and receptivity. Practical example. A person aligned within can express truth clearly while remaining emotionally aware. Not harsh logic and not uncontrolled emotion, but balance. Religion example. What this looks like. Many people suppress emotion in the name of logic or live only emotionally without awareness. This verse reveals alignment happens when awareness and emotion cooperate, when logic and intuition cooperate, when truth and creativity cooperate. Practical example. When you pause and reflect, which is awareness, then respond with understanding, which is creative or emotional wisdom, you are operating from integrated consciousness. The core revelation. This verse destroys the idea that wholeness is division. Instead, it reveals true alignment is integration. The truth about Adam. Adam is unified consciousness, not fragmented, not mind against emotion, not logic against intuition, not awareness against creativity. So now we see, before fear, division, and fragmentation, there was wholeness, integration, and harmony within. And this is why the verse says, he called their name Adam. Because at the deepest level, awareness and creativity were never meant to be enemies. They were meant to move as one. And this becomes very practical in life. When your thoughts align with your emotions, when your awareness aligns with your actions, when your inner world is integrated, your life begins to flow differently. And this mirrors what Jesus said in Matthew 19 when discussing marriage. He said, have ye not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female? Jesus is directly pointing back to Genesis. But then he says, and they two shall be one flesh. Genesis is revealing wholeness within consciousness. It's not about gender. The masculine represents direction, structure, awareness, and intentionality. The feminine represents creativity, receptivity, nurturing, and manifestation. And scripture says, called their name Adam, meaning the complete human experience contains both dimensions. And this is why Paul later says, in Galatians, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. Paul is speaking about unified consciousness, identity beyond division, and restored wholeness. Why this matters spiritually? Fragmented consciousness divides everything. Male versus female, inner versus outer, spiritual versus physical. But aligned awareness recognizes wholeness. And this is why Genesis says their name was Adam. Because the human experience was always meant to function in balance, in union, and in integrated awareness. Verse 3. And Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. First, notice the language. This sounds familiar because Genesis already said God created man in his likeness. Now we see Adam produces Seth in his likeness. Why this matters? This reveals a principle. Whatever consciousness you live from eventually reproduces itself. In his own likeness, after his image. Likeness refers to expression or visible reflection. Likeness is inner nature, character, or pattern. This verse is saying, awareness reproduces what it consistently embodies. Why Seth matters here? Remember, Cain represents reactive consciousness. Abel is alignment silenced. Seth is restored alignment. So now, Adam produces Seth after his image. Meaning, conscious awareness is now reproducing alignment intentionally. This is a shift from Genesis 4. Cain's lineage was reaction to escalation to fragmentation. But Seth's line begins from awareness to restoration to conscious alignment. This verse is saying, whatever state of consciousness you consistently live from becomes what you reproduce in your life. Career example, what this looks like. If you consistently operate from fear, ego, or competition, eventually your habits reflect it. Your leadership reflects it. Your environment reflects it. But if you operate from awareness, integrity, and alignment, you reproduce trust, healthy culture, and grounded leadership. Practical example, a leader who listens, stays emotionally aware, and responds instead of reacting, eventually builds teams that operate the same way. Relationship example, what this looks like. If you consistently operate from insecurity, fear, and emotional reaction, That becomes the atmosphere of the relationship. But if you consistently operate from honesty, awareness, and emotional maturity, those qualities begin reproducing in the connection. Practical example: when one partner communicates calmly, takes accountability, and stays grounded, over time, safety and trust begin to grow in the relationship. Everyday life example, what this looks like. Whatever you repeatedly nurture internally becomes your visible life. If you constantly feed fear, negativity, and division, that becomes your inner image. But if you consistently cultivate awareness, peace, and truth, your actions, words, and life begin reflecting it naturally. The core revelation. This verse reveals consciousness reproduces itself through consistent embodiment. The truth about image: you don't reproduce only biologically. You reproduce patterns, mindsets, emotional states, and environments. So now we see Genesis 5 is tracing the reproduction of consciousness. And this is why the verse matters. In his own likeness, after his image. Because whatever you consistently become within eventually expresses itself through your life. So the real question becomes, what image am I reproducing daily? Because fear reproduces fear. Peace reproduces peace. And awareness reproduces awareness. And now, the genealogy of Seth will begin unfolding differently from Cain's line. Because this line is about restoration, alignment, and conscious development. And this is where Genesis 5 becomes deeply transformative. Verse 4. And the days after Adam, after he had begotten Seth, were 800 years, and he begot sons and daughters. After he had begotten Seth. Remember, Seth equals restored alignment, conscious awareness re-established. So now, after alignment is restored, life continues, creation continues, production continues. This verse is revealing, once awareness realigns, it begins producing from a different state. Next, 800 years. What does this symbolize? In scripture, large numbers often point to fullness, continuation, or extended process. So this is not merely about age. It represents sustained development and continued unfolding over time. He begat sons and daughters. Sons and daughters represent expressions or outcomes or manifestations. This means awareness continues reproducing different expressions from its state. This verse is saying, once alignment is restored within consciousness, it continues producing new expressions, patterns, and outcomes over time. Career example, what this looks like. Once someone becomes aligned in their career, emotionally grounded, aware, and intentional. Next, begot sons and daughters. Now they begin producing healthier communication, stronger teams, better leadership habits, and stable environments. Alignment starts multiplying outwardly. Relationship example, what this looks like. Once someone heals and becomes aware, they communicate differently, respond differently, and choose differently. Next, begot sons and daughters. Now new expressions emerge. There is trust, emotional safety, consistency, and healthier connections. One aligned shift creates many new outcomes. Everyday life example, what this looks like. When someone returns to awareness, they become more conscious, more intentional, and more grounded. Begot sons and daughters. This begins producing peace in decisions, clarity in thoughts, wisdom in action, and healthier habits. Alignment starts reproducing through daily life. The core revelation. This verse reveals alignment is not a one-time event. It becomes a continuous source of new creation. Let's look at the difference between Cain's line and Seth's line. Cain's line reproduced reaction, fragmentation, and escalation. Seth's line reproduces awareness, restoration, and aligned expression. So now we see, once awareness returns, life does not stop. It continues producing, but now from a different state, a different consciousness, and a different image. And this is hopeful because one moment of realignment can begin changing everything that comes after it. So the question becomes, what am I reproducing from my current state of consciousness? Because whatever lives within you consistently will continue multiplying through your life. And now, Genesis 5 will continue unfolding this line of awareness, showing how consciousness develops, evolves, and progresses over time. Genesis 5:5. And all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. Most people read this only biologically. But within this symbolic pattern we've been uncovering, death represents the end of a state, transition, and the passing of an identity or level of consciousness. This verse is not merely saying, Adam physically existed and died. It is revealing every state of consciousness has a cycle. 930 years. Again, large numbers in scripture often represent fullness, completion of a process, and an extended developmental cycle. So this points to the full unfolding of Adam consciousness. And he died. What does this mean here? Adam represents conscious awareness, the choosing self, the beginning of human consciousness. So death here represents the completion of one phase of awareness, making way for another level of development. This verse is saying every identity, mindset, or state of consciousness eventually reaches its limit and passes away. Career example, what this looks like. There are seasons in career where a certain mindset served you, a certain identity carried you, but eventually that version of you dies. Practical example, you may once have been reactive, approval seeking, and trying to prove yourself constantly. But after growth and awareness, that old professional identity no longer fits. It dies. Relationship example, what this looks like. In relationships, you had old ways of loving, unhealthy attachment styles, and reactive communication. Eventually, it can no longer continue if growth is happening. Practical example, the version of you that tolerated disrespect, reacted emotionally, and feared abandonment may eventually die. Meaning, you no longer operate from that state. Everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, old beliefs, fear-based thinking, and unconscious habits. Eventually, they reach their limit. Practical example. A person may once fear God constantly, live from shame, and seek validation externally. But through awareness, that old identity dies and a new consciousness emerges. The core revelation. This verse reveals growth requires the ending of old states. Death is not always distraction. Sometimes it is transition. The ending of an identity, a mindset, or a level of awareness so something deeper can emerge. So now we see, even Adam, the beginning of conscious awareness, the original state, and the first pattern reached an end. And this is deeply important because it reminds us no state is permanent. Not fear, confusion, ego, pain, or fragmentation. Everything passes. Everything evolves. Everything transitions. And this is why transformation is possible. Because old versions of you can die a new awareness can emerge. So the question becomes, what in me is reaching its end so something new can begin? When Genesis says Adam died, it is revealing the ending of a state, loss of alignment, and transition in consciousness. Paul says in Ephesians 2:1, you had he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins. Notice, Paul is speaking to physically alive people, yet he says they were dead. So clearly, he is not talking about biological death. What's dead in sins mean? Sin equals misalignment, missing the mark, or living unconsciously. So dead in sins means living disconnected from awareness, truth, and alignment. Paul then says they were made alive in God, meaning awareness restored, alignment restored, and conscious connection awakened. Jesus also says in John 11:25, he that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. Again, he is speaking beyond biology. Because many people breathe, work, and exist physically, yet internally they are disconnected, unconscious, and fragmented. What Jesus is really revealing, belief is not merely intellectual agreement. It is alignment, trust, and conscious participation in truth. So Jesus is saying, even if you were disconnected, unconscious, or spiritually fragmented, awareness can be restored and you can truly live again. Career example. Someone may be successful externally, physically alive, but internally exhausted, disconnected, and operating unconsciously. Then awareness comes. There's emotional maturity, purpose, and alignment, and suddenly they feel alive again. Relationship example. A person may stay in relationships, go through the motions, but internally, emotionally shut down and disconnected from themselves. Then healing happens. Awareness returns, and they begin feeling deeply again, communicating consciously, and loving intentionally. That is made alive. Everyday life example. Many people live from fear, shame, and unconscious patterns. They exist, but are not truly aware. Then truth awakens within them, and suddenly clarity comes, peace comes, awareness increases. That is resurrection language. That's what Genesis 2 is about. You coming alive again. The core revelation. Genesis, Jesus, and Paul are speaking one consistent pattern. Death is disconnection from alignment, and life is restored conscious awareness. Why this matters? Because this changes scripture from fear-based religion into inner transformation. Because now, resurrection, being born again, made alive, and rising from the dead all become awakenings of consciousness and alignment. Genesis 5:6. And Seth lived 105 years and begot Enosh. Seth means appointed, restored, and re-established alignment. Enosh means human, frail, mortal, and humble awareness of limitation. The pattern, this is very deep. It's saying restored awareness, Seth, produces humility, Enosh. This verse is saying true alignment eventually produces humility, self-awareness, and grounded humanity. Why this matters? Notice the contrast. Cain's line, escalation, ego, retaliation, and amplification. Seth's line, restoration, humility, and conscious awareness. Seth begot Enosh, the inner meaning. It's saying, when awareness is restored, the person becomes more conscious of their actions, limitations, humanity, and the need for alignment. They are not arrogant, reactive, or self-righteous, but grounded, reflective, and teachable. This verse is saying, when consciousness realigns with truth, it begins producing humility and deeper self-awareness. Career example, what this looks like. A person who grows in awareness at work becomes less defensive, listens more, and learns more. Seth produces Enosh. Instead of always needing to be right, they become teachable, emotionally intelligent, and grounded. Practical example, a mature leader says, I may not know everything. Let's work through this together. That is Enosh consciousness, strength with humility. Relationship example, what this looks like. After healing and awareness, a person becomes more reflective, less reactive, and more understanding. Seth produces Enosh. Instead of blaming constantly, they begin saying, I see where I was wrong. I understand how that affected you. Humility begins emerging naturally. Everyday life example, what this looks like. Someone truly growing spiritually becomes less arrogant, less performative, and less judgmental. Seth produces Enosh. Instead of acting superior, they become sincere, grounded, and aware of their humanity. Practical example. Real spiritual maturity says, I am still learning. I need awareness daily. The core revelation. This verse reveals True awareness does not produce superiority. It produces humility. The truth about Enosh. Enosh represents awakened humanity, not perfection, but conscious humility. So now we see, when awareness is restored, the next stage is not ego, it is humility. Because true growth makes you realize how much awareness matters, how unconscious reaction affects life, and how deeply connected everything is. And this is why aligned consciousness becomes softer, not harder, more grounded, not more arrogant. So the real sign of growth is not superiority, but humility, awareness, and sincerity. Verse 7. And Seth lived after he begot Enosh 807 years and begot sons and daughters. First, notice the sequence. Seth equals restored alignment. Enosh equals humility or conscious humanity. Now, after producing Enosh, Seth continues producing sons and daughters. This is saying, once awareness produces humility, life begins generating healthier expressions continuously. Lived after he begot Enosh. It means awareness continues unfolding after humility emerges. Because humility is not the end, it becomes the foundation for further growth. Next, begot sons and daughters. Sons and daughters equals manifestations, expressions, or outcomes. So this means aligned awareness now reproduces healthier thoughts, healthier behaviors, healthier environments, and healthier relationships. This verse is saying, once consciousness realigns and humility is established, it begins continuously producing healthier expressions through life. Career example, what this looks like. Once someone becomes grounded, teachable, and emotionally aware, begot sons and daughters, now this starts reproducing outwardly. Better communication, healthier leadership, stronger collaboration, and trust within teams. Practical example, a leader who listens well, stays calm under pressure, and admits mistakes, eventually creates a healthier work culture around them. Relationship example, what this looks like. Once awareness and humility develop, reactions decrease, emotional maturity increases. Begot sons and daughters. This starts producing safer communication, consistency, emotional stability, and deeper intimacy. Practical example, a person who reflects before reacting, communicates honestly, and takes accountability, begins creating healthier relational patterns naturally. Everyday life example, what this looks like. Once someone becomes spiritually grounded and aware of their humanity, begot sons and daughters, This produces peace in decision making, patience, discernment, and wisdom in everyday life. Practical example. Instead of constantly reacting emotionally, they begin pausing, reflecting, and responding consciously. This verse reveals alignment and humility are not isolated moments. They become ongoing sources of healthier creation. The difference from Cain's line. Cain's line multiplied from reaction, ego, and fragmentation. But Seth's line multiplies awareness, humility, and grounded living. So now we see when consciousness returns to alignment, life begins producing differently. Not more chaos, not more escalation, but clarity, wisdom, and healthier expressions. And this is deeply hopeful because awareness is not just personal, it reproduces itself through everything you touch. So the question becomes, what kind of sons and daughters is my current state producing? Because every state of consciousness eventually multiplies through your life. Verse 8. And all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. Seth means restored alignment, conscious re-establishment of awareness, and the return after fragmentation. But now he died. This is powerful because it shows even restored states are not the final destination. This verse reveals consciousness is always unfolding, evolving, and transitioning. Why this matters? Many people think awakening is the end. Alignment is the finish line. But Genesis keeps repeating every stage has a cycle. And he died in the pattern. This does not diminish Seth. Instead, it reveals one level of awareness gives way to deeper development. This verse is saying, even restored awareness must continue evolving. No stage of consciousness remains static forever. Career example, what this looks like. You may reach emotional maturity, confidence, and stability in your career. But eventually, even that version of you must evolve. Practical example, a person may outgrow old ambitions, old definitions of success, and old ways of working. What once felt aligned may no longer fit the next stage of growth. Relationship example, what this looks like. A relationship may become healthier, more aware, and more grounded, but growth continues. Practical example, old communication styles, even healthy ones, may eventually deepen into greater vulnerability, deeper understanding, and more intentional connection. One level dies, so another can emerge. Everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person may awaken from fear and unconscious living and enter alignment. But eventually, even their understanding evolves further. Practical example, someone may move from rigid belief into awareness, then later, deeper wisdom, deeper compassion, and deeper integration. This verse reveals growth never truly stops. The truth about repeated deaths in Genesis 5. These repeated endings reveal consciousness is not fixed. Every level serves a purpose, unfolds, completes its cycle, and gives way to deeper awareness. So now we see, even Seth, which is restored awareness, realignment, and conscious living, was not the end of the journey, because life is always unfolding. Awareness is always deepening, and consciousness is always evolving. And this is freeing because it means you are allowed to outgrow old versions of yourself, even the versions that once healed you. So the invitation becomes, don't cling to old identities. Don't stop evolving. Don't assume growth has ended, because every completed cycle makes room for deeper awareness. Verse 9, and Enosh lived 90 years and begat Canaan. Enosh means humanity, humility, awareness of limitation, and grounded consciousness. Enosh represents awakened humanity that no longer operates from arrogance. Now Canaan. The name is associated with possession, acquisition, established dwelling, and something firmly obtained. This is powerful. Humility, Enosh, now produces grounded establishment, stable possession, and inner rootedness. The pattern. Before, Cain's line produced wandering and instability. Now Seth's line produces groundedness and stability. What this means spiritually. Once someone becomes humble, aware, and teachable, they begin to truly possess themselves, meaning they have emotional grounding, self-awareness, and stability within. This verse is saying, humble and aware consciousness eventually produces inner stability, rootedness, and grounded identity. Career example, what this looks like. Someone who becomes teachable, emotionally aware, and grounded eventually develops stability in leadership and direction. Enosh produces Canaan. Instead of constantly proving themselves, they become secure in their value, grounded in purpose, and stable in decision making. Practical example, a mature professional no longer chases validation constantly, works with clarity and steadiness. They've possessed themselves internally. Relationship example, what this looks like. When humility develops in relationships, reactions decrease, Self-awareness increases. Enosh produces Canaan. Now the person becomes emotionally stable, secure, and grounded in who they are. Practical example. Instead of needing constant reassurance and fearing abandonment, they develop emotional rootedness. Everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a humble person eventually becomes settled, grounded, and less spiritually restless. Enosh produces Canaan. Instead of constantly searching outside themselves, they begin living from inner awareness, trusting discernment and remaining centered. The core revelation. This verse reveals humility eventually produces stability. The deep pattern. First, awareness is restored, Seth. Then humility develops, Enosh. Then grounded identity emerges, Canaan. So now we see true humility is not weakness. It becomes the foundation for inner stability. Because once you stop performing, stop pretending, and stop operating from ego, you begin to truly settle within yourself. And this is why aligned consciousness grows differently from fragmented consciousness. One produces restlessness, escalation, and instability. The other produces humility, grounding, and rooted awareness. So the question becomes, am I building my life from ego or from grounded awareness? Because only one of them leads to true inner stability. Verse 10. And Enosh lived after he begot Canaan 815 years and begat sons and daughters. Enosh represents humility, conscious humanity, and grounded awareness of limitation. Canaan represents stability, rootedness, and inner possession. Now, after producing Canaan, Enosh continues producing sons and daughters. This is revealing. Once humility produces inner stability, healthier expressions begin multiplying naturally. Lived after he begot Canaan. This is important. It means awareness continues unfolding after stability is established. Because grounding is not stagnation, it becomes a foundation for further creation. Begat sons and daughters. Sons and daughters equals outcomes, manifestations, or expressions. So this means grounded awareness now begins reproducing healthier habits, healthier environments, healthier relationships, and healthier decisions. This verse is saying, when humility produces grounded identity, life begins consistently reproducing healthier and more stable expressions. Career example, what this looks like. A grounded professional no longer works from panic or insecurity. They become steady and intentional. Begat sons and daughters. This begins producing stable leadership, wise decision making, healthier workplace culture, and long-term growth. Practical example. Instead of constantly reacting emotionally, they become calm under pressure, dependable, and consistent. And that consistency starts shaping the whole environment. Relationship example, what this looks like. Once someone becomes emotionally grounded, they stop operating from fear. They stop needing constant reassurance. Begat sons and daughters. This produces trust, emotional safety, consistency, and healthy communication. Practical example. A grounded person listens before reacting, communicates clearly, and remains emotionally present. And healthier connection naturally grows from it. Everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a grounded person becomes less restless, less performative, and more centered. Begat sons and daughters. This produces peace, discernment, patience, and wisdom in daily life. Practical example. Instead of constantly seeking external validation, they begin trusting inner awareness, moving with clarity, and living intentionally. This verse reveals stability within eventually creates stability around you. The deep pattern of Set's line. Set is restored awareness. Enosh is humility. Canaan is grounded identity. Sons and daughters are stable expressions multiplying outwardly. So now we see, when awareness becomes grounded, life begins producing differently. Not chaos, emotional instability, or fragmentation, but consistency, wisdom, and steady growth. And this is deeply practical because true transformation is not just emotional moments or temporary inspiration. It becomes sustained expression over time. So the real question becomes, what kind of atmosphere is my inner state reproducing daily? Because grounded consciousness eventually shapes everything around it. Verse 11, and all the days of Enosh were 905 years and he died. Enosh represents humility, conscious humanity, awareness of limitation, and grounded self-awareness. Now, and he died. This is important because it reveals even humility is not the final stage. This verse is showing every stage of consciousness serves a purpose, then gives way to deeper development. Why this matters? A person may awaken, become humble, become self-aware, but growth continues because eventually, even old understandings of humility must deepen into greater wisdom and integration. He died in the pattern. This means the inner stage completed its cycle. Not failure, not distraction, but transition into the next unfolding stage of awareness. This verse is saying, even grounded humility must continue evolving. Consciousness is always unfolding into deeper levels of awareness. Career example, what this looks like. A person may become teachable, emotionally mature, and grounded at work. But eventually, their understanding of leadership evolves further. Practical example. At first, humility may mean listening more. Later, it deepens into mentoring others, empowering teams, and creating environments for collective growth. One stage dies, so a deeper one can emerge. Relationship example, what this looks like. Someone may move from emotional reactivity into humility and accountability. But eventually, even that evolves into deeper emotional presence, greater compassion, and intentional partnership. Practical example. What once felt like growth, apologizing after conflict, may later evolve into preventing unnecessary conflicts through awareness. Spiritual or everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person may move from arrogance into humility, but eventually, humility deepens into wisdom, compassion, and integrated living. Practical example, at first, humility may sound like I don't know everything. Later, it becomes I can hold truth with grace and understanding. This verse reveals no level of awareness is meant to become static identity. Genesis 5 keeps repeating this pattern to show transformation is continual. Every stage unfolds, serves its purpose, and transitions into something deeper. So now we see, even humility, one of the most beautiful stages of awareness, was not the end. Because life is always inviting deeper consciousness, deeper integration, and deeper understanding. And this is freeing. You are not meant to stay frozen in one version of yourself. Even the healed versions, even the awakened versions, because growth continues, awareness deepens, consciousness unfolds endlessly. So the invitation becomes remain teachable, remain open, remain willing to evolve. Because every ending in Genesis 5 is making room for a deeper level of awareness to emerge. Verse 12. And Canaan lived 70 years and begat Mahalalel. Canaan represents grounded identity, inner stability, rooted awareness, and possessing oneself internally. So now the question becomes, what does grounded awareness produce next? Mahalalel. This name is powerful. It combines Mahalal, which is praise, brightness, celebration, and shining expression, and El, which is God, higher awareness or divine nature. Mahalalel represents joyful alignment with truth, elevated awareness, and conscious appreciation of life and reality. The pattern. This is beautiful because once someone becomes internally grounded, they stop living only in survival mode. Now awareness begins to appreciate. They perceive beauty, express gratitude, and reflect higher consciousness naturally. Why this progression matters? Notice how different this is from Cain's line. Cain's line moved toward escalation, retaliation, and fragmentation. But Seth's line keeps moving toward humility, groundedness, and elevated awareness. This verse is saying, when consciousness becomes grounded and stable, it begins producing joyful awareness, appreciation, and elevated perception of life. Career example, what this looks like. A grounded professional eventually stops chasing validation constantly and operating from fear. Canaan produces Mahalalel. Now they begin enjoying the work, appreciating growth, uplifting others, and creating positive environments. Practical example. Instead of competing constantly, they begin mentoring, encouraging, and celebrating collective success. Because grounded awareness naturally produces uplifting energy. Relationship example, what this looks like. When someone becomes emotionally grounded, fear decreases, insecurity decreases. Canaan produces Mahalalel. Now they begin appreciating their partner consciously, expressing gratitude, and creating emotional warmth. Practical example. Instead of taking love for granted, they begin intentionally expressing appreciation and creating joyful connection. Spiritual or everyday life example. What this looks like. Spiritually, a grounded person stops living in fear and in constant striving. Canaan produces Mahalalel. Now awareness becomes appreciative, joyful, peaceful, and consciously connected. Practical example. Simple things begin feeling meaningful. Silence, presence, nature, kindness, and conscious living. Life itself becomes sacred again. The core revelation. This verse reveals grounded awareness eventually produces joyful and elevated consciousness. The deep pattern. Seth, restored awareness. Enosh, humility. Canaan, grounded identity. Mahalalel, joyful, elevated awareness. So now we see, true awareness does not only heal, it eventually learns to rejoice. Because once fear quiets down, once insecurity settles, and inner grounding develops, you begin to truly appreciate life consciously. And this is one of the signs of deeper alignment. Gratitude without performance, joy without external validation, and peace without constant striving. Because elevated awareness naturally begins to celebrate, appreciate, and reflect beauty. And now, Genesis 5, will continue unfolding this progression, showing consciousness moving from restoration to humility to groundedness, and now toward radiant awareness and deeper alignment. Verse 13. And Canaan lived after he begot Mahalalel 840 years and begat sons and daughters. Canaan represents grounded identity, inner rootedness, and stability within. Mahalalel represents joyful awareness, elevated perception, conscious appreciation, and alignment expressed beautifully. Now, after producing Mahalalel, Canaan continues producing sons and daughters. This verse is saying, once grounded awareness produces elevated consciousness, healthier expressions begin multiplying consistently throughout life. Lived after he begot Mahalalel. This is important because grounded awareness continues unfolding after joy and appreciation emerge. Meaning, growth continues. Consciousness keeps expressing itself in new ways. Begat sons and daughters. Sons and daughters equals expressions, manifestations, or outcomes. So this means elevated awareness now reproduces healthier relationships, healthier environments, wiser decisions, and uplifting expressions. This verse is saying, when consciousness becomes grounded and elevated, it continuously produces healthier and more uplifting expressions through life. Career example, what this looks like. A grounded and aware professional no longer operates from insecurity. They bring calm and positivity into work. Begat sons and daughters. This produces healthier team culture, encouragement instead of competition, creative collaboration, and long-term stability. Practical example. Instead of always protecting their own image, they begin uplifting others, sharing opportunities, and creating environments where others thrive. Because elevated awareness naturally reproduces healthy influence. Relationship example, what this looks like. When someone becomes emotionally grounded, appreciative, and aware, begat sons and daughters, this produces warmth, emotional safety, gratitude, and intentional connection. Practical example. Instead of focusing constantly on what is lacking, they begin appreciating what is present, expressing love consciously, and creating peace within the relationship. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person with elevated awareness begins living more intentionally, more peacefully, and more consciously. Begat sons and daughters, this produces patience, wisdom, kindness, and clarity in daily life. Practical example. Simple interactions change. They speak more gently, react less impulsively, and move through life with greater awareness. Their inner state starts affecting everyone around them positively. The core revelation. This verse reveals elevated awareness naturally multiplies through your actions, atmosphere, and relationships. The deep pattern of Set's line. Set is restored awareness, Enosh is humility. Canaan is grounded identity. Mahalalel is joyful, elevated awareness. Sons and daughters, uplifting expressions multiplying outwardly. So now we see awareness is not meant to stay hidden within you. Once it becomes grounded, elevated, and aligned, it naturally begins shaping your words, your relationships, your environment, and your influence. And this is one of the deepest truths in Genesis 5. Consciousness reproduces itself everywhere it goes. So the real question becomes, what kind of atmosphere is my awareness creating around me daily? Because elevated consciousness eventually becomes visible in every area of life. Verse 14. And all the days of Canaan were 910 years, and he died. Now the pattern repeats again, and he died. By now, we should recognize that Genesis 5 is teaching us something far deeper than biological history. Canaan represents grounded identity, rooted awareness, inner stability, and possessing oneself consciously. And from that groundedness came Mahalalel, elevated joyful awareness. Now he died. This reveals something important. Even grounded stability is not the final stage. This verse is saying, every level of awareness eventually completes its cycle and gives way to deeper transformation. Why this matters? Many people reach emotional stability, healing, and groundedness, and unconsciously think I've arrived. But Genesis keeps repeating, growth continues. Consciousness unfolds further. Awareness deepens endlessly. The deeper meaning of death here. This is not distraction. It is transition. The completion of one stage, so another can emerge. This verse is saying, even stable and grounded awareness must continue evolving into deeper levels of consciousness. Career example, what this looks like. A person may become emotionally mature, grounded in leadership, and stable professionally, but eventually, even their understanding of success evolves. Practical example. At first, success may mean stability and recognition. Later, success becomes impact, mentorship, and meaningful contribution. One version of ambition dies for a deeper purpose to emerge. Relationship example, what this looks like. A relationship may become stable, emotionally safe and grounded, but eventually, even that deepens further. Practical example, at first, healing means less conflict. Later, growth becomes intentional intimacy, conscious partnership, and emotional presence. Old ways of relating pass away, so deeper connection can emerge. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person may become grounded, peaceful, and self-aware. But eventually, awareness deepens into wisdom, compassion, integration, and deeper understanding of life. Practical example, At first, spirituality may focus on personal healing. Later, it expands into service, understanding others, and living consciously in everyday life. This verse reveals no stage of consciousness is meant to become permanent identity. The repeating pattern of Genesis 5. Every and he died is teaching transformation never stops. Every stage unfolds, fulfills its purpose, and transitions into something deeper. So now we see even grounded awareness, stability, rootedness, and emotional maturity was not the end of the journey, because life keeps calling consciousness deeper, deeper wisdom, deeper integration, deeper awareness. And this is freeing. You are allowed to outgrow every version of yourself, even the stable versions, even the healed versions, because consciousness is alive. It keeps unfolding, it keeps expanding. So the invitation becomes stay open, stay teachable, keep evolving, because every ending in Genesis 5 is simply preparing consciousness for its next unfolding stage. Verse 15. And Mahalalel lived 60 and 5 years and begot Jared. Now the pattern moves into another powerful stage, because elevated awareness is now about to produce descent, grounding into reality and deeper engagement with life. Mahalalel represents joyful awareness, elevated perception, conscious appreciation, and praise and alignment. This is the stage where awareness begins rejoicing in truth and sees life with gratitude and clarity. Now, Jared. The name Jared is associated with descent, coming down, and bringing something into a lower realm. This is extremely deep, because once awareness becomes elevated, it must eventually descend into practical living. This is saying elevated consciousness must eventually become embodied and lived practically in everyday life. Why this matters? Many people have moments of awakening, insight, inspiration, and spiritual elevation. But the real question is, can you bring that awareness into daily life? Mahalalel begot Jared. This means joyful awareness now produces embodiment and grounded application. Not just inspiration, but integration into real living. This verse is saying, elevated awareness eventually descends into practical embodiment and lived experience. Career example, what this looks like. A person may gain wisdom, become emotionally aware, and understand healthy leadership, but eventually they must apply it practically. Mahalalel produces Jared. This looks like implementing healthy systems, communicating consciously daily, and leading with consistency. Practical example, it's not enough to talk about healthy culture. You must embody it in meetings, decisions, and interactions. You must become the word. It must be seen in you. That's what John meant. And the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. Relationship example. What this looks like. Someone may understand love consciously, value emotional awareness, but eventually it must become visible in daily behavior. Mahalalel produces Jared. This becomes showing up consistently, listening intentionally, and expressing care practically. Practical example, not just saying I love you, but creating emotional safety through actions daily. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person may feel deeply connected during meditation, prayer, or insight, but eventually, awareness must descend into ordinary life. Mahalalel produces Jared. This looks like conscious speech, mindful decisions, patience in difficult moments, and grounded living. Practical example, not just feeling spiritual in private moments, but remaining aligned in traffic, conflict, work, parenting, and daily interactions. This verse reveals true awareness must eventually become embodied in practical life. It must be seen in you. The deep pattern. Seth restored awareness. Enosh humility. Canaan grounded identity. Mahalalel elevated joyful awareness. Jared embodied and practical consciousness. So now we see awareness is not meant to stay abstract, emotional, or inspirational only. Eventually, it must descend. It must become lived. It must become embodied. Because true transformation is not temporary inspiration. It is awareness expressed consistently through daily life. And this is where many people struggle. They experience elevation, but resist embodiment. Yet Genesis shows us the journey is not complete until awareness becomes practical living. So the question becomes, how much of what I know am I actually living? Because embodied awareness is where transformation becomes real. Verse 16. Mahalalel lived after he begot Jared 830 years and begot sons and daughters. Now we continue seeing the unfolding of the pattern. Because once awareness becomes embodied and practical, Jared, it begins reproducing itself throughout every area of life. Mahalalel represents elevated awareness, joyful alignment, and appreciative consciousness. Jared is descent, embodiment, and practical lived awareness. Now, after producing Jared, Mahalalel continues producing sons and daughters. This verse is revealing. Once elevated awareness becomes embodied in daily life, it begins producing consistent, healthy expressions everywhere. Lived after he begot Jared. This is important because it shows awareness continues unfolding after embodiment begins. Meaning, growth becomes sustained. Consciousness becomes increasingly integrated. Begat sons and daughters. Sons and daughters equals manifestations, outcomes, and expressions. So this means embodied awareness now reproduces healthier habits, wiser decisions, grounded environments, conscious relationships, and stable influence. This verse is saying, when awareness becomes embodied and lived practically, it continuously produces healthier and more aligned expressions through life. Career example, what this looks like. A person who truly embodies awareness at work no longer only talks about emotional intelligence, they consistently practice it. Begat sons and daughters. This begins producing calmer work environments, healthier communication, stable leadership culture, and trust within teams. Practical example. Instead of reacting emotionally under stress, they remain grounded, communicate clearly, and create safety around them. And that energy begins shaping the workplace itself. Relationship example, what this looks like. Someone who embodies awareness in relationships doesn't just understand healthy love intellectually, they practice it consistently. Begat sons and daughters, this produces emotional safety, consistency, trust, and deeper intimacy. Practical example, not just apologizing after conflict, but becoming aware enough to reduce unnecessary harm before it happens. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, awareness becomes lived, practical, and integrated. Begat sons and daughters. This produces patience in daily stress, mindful speech, conscious choices, and grounded peace. Practical example. A spiritually aware person doesn't only feel aligned during prayer, they carry awareness into conversations, work, parenting, and ordinary life. This verse reveals embodied awareness naturally reproduces alignment in every area it touches. So now we see the goal of awareness is not temporary inspiration or isolated spiritual moments. The goal is embodiment, integration, and consistent conscious living. Because once awareness becomes lived reality, it begins transforming everything around you naturally. And this is the beauty of the pattern. Healed consciousness reproduces healing. Grounded awareness reproduces stability. Embodied truth reproduces alignment. So the question becomes, is my awareness only something I understand or something I consistently live? Because true transformation eventually becomes visible in everyday life. Verse 17, and all the days of Mahalalel were 890 and 5 years, and he died. Once again, Genesis repeats the same phrase, and he died. And by now, we can clearly see that this chapter is teaching us about cycles of consciousness, evolving awareness, and transformation through stages. Mahalalel represents elevated awareness, joyful alignment, appreciative consciousness, and conscious praise and perception. And from Mahalalel came Jared, which is embodied practical awareness. Now he died. This reveals something profound. Even elevated awareness is not the final stage. This verse is showing, no matter how beautiful a stage of awareness is, consciousness continues unfolding beyond it. Why this matters? Many people reach peace, emotional healing, and spiritual awareness, and unconsciously begin identifying with that stage permanently. But Genesis keeps reminding us, awareness is alive. Growth continues. Evolution never stops. He died in this pattern. This does not mean failure or loss. It means completion of one level so deeper awareness can emerge. This verse is saying, even elevated and joyful awareness must continue evolving into deeper levels of embodied consciousness. Career example, what this looks like. A person may become emotionally aware, fulfilled in work, grounded and positive, but eventually their understanding of contribution deepens further. Practical example, at first, success may feel like personal fulfillment. Later, it evolves into legacy, mentorship, and empowering others. One stage of awareness dies, so deeper purpose can emerge. Relationship example, what this looks like. A relationship may become joyful, peaceful, and emotionally healthy. But eventually, awareness deepens further into intentional growth together, conscious partnership, and shared transformation. Practical example. At first, healing means peace after conflict. Later, growth means building something meaningful together consciously. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person may experience gratitude, peace, and elevated awareness. But eventually, awareness deepens into wisdom, service, embodiment, and integrated living. Practical example. At first, spirituality may feel emotional and uplifting. Later, it becomes grounded, practical, and lived consistently through ordinary life. This verse reveals every stage of awareness is meant to evolve into something deeper. Every repetition of "and he died" is teaching. Do not become trapped in one stage of consciousness, because growth unfolds, transitions, and deepens continuously. So now we see even joyful awareness, gratitude, peace, and elevated perception was not the end. Because consciousness is infinite in its unfolding, there is always deeper integration, deeper embodiment, deeper wisdom. And this is beautiful because it means life is not static. Awareness is not fixed. Transformation never truly stops. So the invitation becomes remain open, remain teachable, continue evolving, because every ending in Genesis 5 is simply consciousness making room for a deeper unfolding. Verse 18. And Jared lived 162 years, and he begat Enoch. Now the pattern reaches a very powerful stage, because embodied awareness, Jared, is now about to produce Enoch. And Enoch becomes one of the most important symbolic figures in Genesis. Jared represents descent, embodiment, awareness lived practically, and consciousness expressed through daily life. Jared was the stage where awareness stopped being abstract and became lived reality. Now Enoch. Enoch means dedicated, initiated, disciplined, and trained. This is powerful because once awareness becomes embodied consistently, it produces dedication and intentional conscious living. This is saying awareness that is lived daily eventually becomes disciplined alignment. Why this matters? Many people experience awareness temporarily, feel inspired occasionally, but embodiment over time creates consistency, discipline, and intentionality. Jared begat Enoch. This means practical lived awareness produces a consciously dedicated life, not random growth or emotional fluctuation, but intentional alignment. This verse is saying, when awareness becomes consistently embodied, it produces disciplined and intentional consciousness. Career example, what this looks like. A person who consistently practices awareness at work, emotionally grounded, intentional, and stable, eventually develops disciplined leadership. Jared produces Enoch. This becomes consistency under pressure, intentional communication, reliable character, and focused purpose. Practical example, not just talking about professionalism, but consistently embodying integrity daily. Relationship example, what this looks like. A person who embodies awareness in relationships eventually becomes intentional in how they love. Jared produces Enoch. This produces consistency, reliability, emotional discipline, and conscious partnership. Practical example, instead of loving only emotionally in moments, they become intentional in communication, consistent in care, and disciplined in protecting the relationship. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person moves from occasional awareness into intentional conscious living. Jared produces Enoch. This becomes daily awareness, intentional reflection, disciplined alignment, and conscious habits. Practical example, not just feeling aligned during spiritual moments, but building daily practices that sustain awareness consistently. The core revelation, this verse reveals embodied awareness eventually produces intentional and disciplined consciousness. So now we see awareness is not meant to remain temporary, emotional, or inconsistent. Eventually, it becomes disciplined, intentional, and embodied consistently. And this is where transformation becomes powerful. When alignment is no longer occasional, but becomes your way of living. Because true dedication is not performance or religious striving. It is consciously choosing alignment repeatedly. So the question becomes, what am I consistently dedicating my awareness to daily? Because whatever you repeatedly practice eventually shapes who you become. Verse 19. And Jared lived after he begot Enoch 800 years and begot sons and daughters. Now the pattern continues unfolding. Because once awareness becomes embodied, disciplined, and intentional, it begins reproducing itself throughout every area of life consistently. Jared represents embodied awareness, practical consciousness, and lived alignment. Enoch represents dedication, intentional living, and disciplined awareness. Now, after producing Enoch, Jared continues producing sons and daughters. This verse reveals, once awareness becomes intentional and disciplined, it begins continuously producing aligned expressions through life. Lived after he begat Enoch. This matters because embodiment continues unfolding after dedication begins. Meaning, awareness becomes sustained, intentionality becomes lifestyle. Begat sons and daughters. Sons and daughters equals manifestations, outcomes, and expressions. So this means disciplined consciousness now reproduces healthier routines, wiser decisions, stable habits, intentional relationships, and grounded environments. This verse is saying, when awareness becomes disciplined and intentional, it continuously produces healthier and aligned outcomes throughout life. Career example, what this looks like. A professional who develops disciplined awareness, stays emotionally grounded consistently, operates intentionally instead of reactively, begat sons and daughters. This produces dependable leadership, trust from others, stable team culture, and long-term growth. Practical example, not just acting professionally occasionally, but consistently embodying integrity even under pressure. And over time, that consistency shapes the whole workplace atmosphere. Relationship example, what this looks like. A person with disciplined awareness in relationships no longer laughs only emotionally in moments, but becomes intentional consistently. Begat sons and daughters. This produces emotional safety, reliability, trust, and healthy communication patterns. Practical example, not just apologizing after mistakes, but becoming conscious enough to prevent unnecessary damage repeatedly. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, awareness becomes habitual, integrated, and intentional. Begat sons and daughters. This produces mindful living, emotional regulation, patience, and grounded daily awareness. Practical example, not just feeling aligned during spiritual moments, but carrying awareness consistently into ordinary life. The core revelation. This verse reveals intentional awareness eventually reshapes every area of life consistently. So now we see transformation is not built through occasional inspiration or temporary emotion. It becomes real when awareness becomes disciplined, alignment becomes consistent, and consciousness becomes embodied daily. Because whatever you repeatedly practice eventually reproduces itself throughout your life. And this is why intentional living matters so deeply. Your habits shape your atmosphere. Your awareness shapes your relationships, and your consistency shapes your reality. So the question becomes, what kind of life is my daily awareness reproducing? Because disciplined consciousness eventually becomes visible everywhere it goes. Verse 20. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Again, Genesis repeats the pattern, and he died. Quick reminder of Jared. Jared represents embodiment, practical awareness, lived alignment. And from Jared came Enoch, which is disciplined, intentional consciousness. Now he died. This reveals another profound truth. Even embodied and disciplined awareness is not the final stage. This verse is showing every level of consciousness eventually completes its cycle and gives way to deeper unfolding. Why this matters? Many people reach a point where they become disciplined, intentional, emotionally aware, and grounded in practice, and unconsciously think this is the highest stage. But Genesis keeps teaching, awareness keeps evolving, consciousness keeps unfolding, transformation never stops. He died in the pattern. It means transition into deeper integration. This verse is saying, even disciplined and embodied consciousness must continue evolving into deeper levels of awareness. Career example, what this looks like. A person may become disciplined professionally, emotionally intelligent, and intentional in leadership, but eventually their understanding deepens further. Practical example, at first, discipline may focus on personal excellence. Later, it evolves into developing others, creating legacy, and building meaningful impact. One level of purpose dies, so a deeper one can emerge. Relationship example, what this looks like. Someone may become consistent, emotionally mature, and intentional in love. But eventually, awareness deepens beyond stability into conscious partnership, shared growth, and deeper emotional presence. Practical example, at first, discipline means avoiding harmful reactions. Later, awareness becomes deeply understanding your partner, growing together intentionally, and embodying compassion consistently. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person may develop strong practices, intentional living, and disciplined awareness. But eventually, awareness deepens beyond routine into wisdom, effortless embodiment, and natural integration. Practical example. At first, alignment may require constant effort. Later, Awareness becomes more natural and integrated into being itself. This verse reveals no stage of awareness is the final destination. Every and he died is teaching. Consciousness is always moving forward. Every stage unfolds, fulfills its purpose, and transitions into deeper awareness. So now we see even disciplined awareness, intentional living, grounded practice, and embodied alignment was not the end, because transformation keeps unfolding endlessly. There is always deeper wisdom, deeper embodiment, and deeper integration. And this is freeing because it means you are not meant to stop growing, not spiritually, not emotionally, not consciously. So the invitation becomes remain open, remain teachable, continue unfolding. Verse 21. And Enoch lived 60 and 5 years and begot Methuselah. Now we arrive at one of the deepest transitions in Genesis 5. Because Enoch represents disciplined awareness, intentional consciousness, and dedicated alignment. And from that state emerges Methuselah. Methuselah's name is often associated with man of the death. His death shall bring. But symbolically, it points toward long endurance, extended continuation, and deep-reaching consequence. Within this pattern, Methuselah represents consciousness becoming aware of the long-term impact of how one lives. This is profound because once awareness becomes disciplined, intentional, and embodied, a person begins to realize every action carries consequence. Every state reproduces over time. Consciousness shapes the future. This verse is saying intentional awareness eventually produces deep understanding of long-term impact and legacy. Why this matters? Before awakening, people react impulsively, live unconsciously, and think only short-term. But disciplined awareness begins asking, what is this creating over time? Enoch begot Methuselah, meaning dedicated consciousness produces awareness of consequence, continuity, and legacy, not just temporary emotion, but long-term conscious living. This verse is saying, when awareness becomes disciplined and intentional, it begins perceiving the deeper long-term effects of thoughts, actions, and ways of living. Career example, what this looks like. A mature professional begins realizing every decision shapes culture over time. Enoch produces Methuselah. This becomes thinking long-term, building sustainable systems, mentoring others, and creating lasting impact. Practical example. Instead of chasing quick recognition, they begin asking, what kind of environment am I building years from now? Relationship example, what this looks like. A conscious person begins understanding small patterns shape relationships over time. Enoch produces Methuselah. This produces intentional communication, emotional consistency, and awareness of long-term trust. Practical example. They realize repeated dishonesty, emotional neglect, and constant reactions. eventually shape the entire relationship. So they begin living more consciously. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, awareness begins moving beyond emotional moments into long-term transformation. Enoch produces Methuselah. This becomes consistent practice, patient growth, conscious habits, and understanding how daily awareness shapes the future. Practical example. A person begins realizing who they become is shaped by what they repeatedly nurture daily. This verse reveals mature awareness begins perceiving long-term consequence and legacy. So now we see true awareness eventually asks, what am I creating over time? Because mature consciousness understands every thought shapes identity, every habit shapes character, every action shapes destiny. And this is where awareness becomes truly powerful. Not when it only changes moments, but when it begins shaping generations of consequence within your life. Because intentional living eventually awakens responsibility, foresight, and legacy consciousness. So the question becomes, what future is my present awareness creating? Because whatever consciousness consistently nurtures eventually becomes legacy. Verse 22. And Enoch walked with God after he begot Methuselah 300 years and begot sons and daughters. Now we reach one of the most powerful phrases in Genesis. Enoch walked with God. Most people read this as a man physically walking beside a deity somewhere in space. But within the pattern we've been uncovering, this is speaking about conscious alignment, sustained awareness, and living in harmony with truth continuously. Walked with God. What does this mean? Throughout scripture, walking equals way of living, path of consciousness, daily conduct. And we already established God equals ultimate truth or higher awareness or inner knowing. So Enoch walked with God means Enoch lived in continual alignment with truth and awareness. Notice when this happened. The verse says, after he begot Methuselah. This is important. Remember, Methuselah represents awareness of consequence, long-term impact, and legacy consciousness. Once Enoch became aware that every action shapes the future, that consciousness reproduces itself over time, his life became more intentionally aligned. This is powerful psychologically. Real transformation often happens when a person becomes deeply conscious of consequence. Suddenly, awareness becomes more consistent, choices become more intentional, and alignment becomes daily practice. 300 years. Symbolically, this points to sustained continuity and long-term consistency. This is saying alignment was no longer temporary for Enoch. It became his way of life. And begat sons and daughters, meaning this aligned consciousness reproduced itself outwardly into actions, influence, environment, and expressions. This verse is saying, once awareness becomes conscious of long-term consequence, a person begins living in sustained alignment with truth, and that alignment reproduces itself throughout life. Career example, what this looks like. A mature leader begins realizing every decision shapes people over time. So they begin leading consciously, communicating intentionally, and operating with integrity consistently. Walk with God, meaning they no longer operate only for personal gain. They align with truth, fairness, wisdom, and long-term impact. Practical example, they ask, what kind of environment am I creating? And how do my actions affect others long term? Relationship example, what this looks like. A conscious partner realizes daily actions shape emotional trust over time. Walked with God. This becomes intentional love, emotional consistency, truthful communication, and conscious partnership. Practical example. Instead of reacting impulsively, they begin responding with awareness consistently because they understand repeated actions shape the entire relationship. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person moves beyond occasional inspiration into sustained conscious living. Walked with God. This means living aware daily, aligning actions with truth, and remaining conscious in ordinary life. Practical example, not just feeling spiritual during prayer, but carrying awareness into work, conversations, stress, conflict, and decisions. The core revelation. This verse reveals true alignment becomes a consistent way of living, not a temporary experience. So now we see walking with God is not religious performance. It is living consciously, aligning consistently, and embodying truth daily. And this is why Enoch stands out. Alignment became his lifestyle, not occasional awareness, but sustained consciousness. And this is the invitation hidden in the verse. Not merely to visit awareness sometimes, but to walk in alignment consistently. Because transformation becomes real when awareness becomes the way you live. Verse 23. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. This verse may look simple, but the number here is deeply symbolic. Because Enoch is the first figure in this genealogy whose years are described differently in a way that immediately stands out. Why 365 matters? 365 mirrors the full solar cycle, a complete year, fullness of a cycle. This is powerful symbolically because Enoch represents sustained alignment, working consciously, and intentional awareness lived daily. This is revealing. Enoch represents a complete cycle of aligned consciousness. The pattern. Before this, we saw fragmented consciousness, reactive living, and evolving awareness. But with Enoch, awareness has become integrated into the whole cycle of life. Why this matters? 365 symbolizes consistency, wholeness, and alignment through every season, not occasional awareness, not temporary spiritual highs, but consciousness sustained continuously. All the days of Enoch, meaning every phase of his life reflected alignment, not perfection, but intentional conscious living. This verse is saying, sustained alignment eventually integrates awareness into every cycle and season of life. Career example, what this looks like. A mature professional eventually becomes consistently grounded, stable under pressure, and intentional across changing situations. 365 years, meaning awareness is no longer situational. Whether success, pressure, conflict, or uncertainty, they remain aligned, conscious, and intentional. Practical example, not emotionally intelligent only when things are easy, but carrying awareness through every season of work life. Relationship example, what this looks like. In relationships, alignment becomes daily, consistent, and integrated. 365 years, meaning love is no longer only emotional moment. It becomes steady presence, intentional communication, and conscious partnership through all seasons. Practical example, not loving only when things feel good, but remaining aware, honest, and intentional even during difficulty. Everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, awareness becomes integrated into ordinary life and present in every season. 365 years, meaning consciousness is no longer separate from daily living. Practical example, awareness remains present in joy, in stress, in routine, in uncertainty, and in ordinary moments. Alignment becomes continuous rather than occasional. This verse reveals true transformation integrates awareness into the full cycle of life. The deep pattern. Enoch represents complete integration of awareness, not fragmented consciousness, but awareness lived consistently through every season. So now we see the number 365 is not random. It reflects wholeness, continuity, and sustained alignment. Because the deepest transformation is not temporary awakening, it is awareness integrated into your entire way of living. And this is why Enoch stands apart in the genealogy. Alignment became continuous, consciousness became integrated, awareness touched every season of life. So the question becomes, is my awareness seasonal or integrated into the way I live daily? Because true alignment remains present through every cycle of life. Verse 24, and Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. This is one of the most mysterious verses in Genesis 5. And for centuries, people have asked, did Enoch physically disappear? Was he taken into heaven? Did he escape death? But within the symbolic pattern we've been uncovering, this verse is revealing something far deeper about consciousness and transformation. Enoch walked with God. We already established this means sustained alignment with truth, conscious living, and continual awareness. Enoch represents integrated consciousness, disciplined awareness, and alignment embodied consistently. Next line, and he was not. This phrase is powerful. It does not say he died like the others. Instead, he was not. This reveals the old fragmented identity was no longer present. Why this matters? Enoch represents a stage where awareness became fully integrated. Consciousness became aligned consistently, so the old reactive self dissolved. This mirrors Paul's language: I live, yet not I, but Christ in me. And the old man is crucified, because aligned consciousness eventually transforms identity so deeply, the former self is no longer. For God took him. Again, God equals ultimate truth, or higher awareness, or alignment. So this does not necessarily mean physical transportation somewhere in space. It means consciousness became fully absorbed into alignment and truth. Enoch became so aligned, so integrated, so consciously unified that the fragmented self no longer governed him. This verse is saying sustained alignment eventually dissolves fragmented identity, and consciousness becomes fully absorbed into truth and awareness. Career example, what this looks like. A person once operated from insecurity, ego, and constant validation seeking. But after years of awareness and intentional growth, that old professional identity no longer exists. He was not, meaning the reactive version of them dissolved. Now they lead consciously, operate calmly, and remain grounded naturally. Relationship example, what this looks like. A person once reacted emotionally, feared abandonment, and created chaos unconsciously. But through deep awareness and healing, that old relational identity disappears. He was not, meaning the fearful self no longer dominates. Now they communicate consciously, love intentionally, and remain emotionally grounded. Everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person once lived fragmented, fearful, and disconnected from themselves, but sustained awareness transforms them deeply. God took him, meaning alignment becomes their natural state, not forced, not performative, but integrated. Practical example, awareness becomes effortless, embodied, and continuous. This verse reveals sustained alignment eventually transforms identity so deeply that the old fragmented self dissolves. Why Enoch's ending is different. Everyone else and he died, but Enoch, he was not. Because this stage represents transcendence of fragmented consciousness, not disappearance, but transformation of identity. So now we see Enoch did not merely believe differently, he became different through sustained awareness, continual alignment, and intentional living, the old fragmented self faded away. And this is the invitation hidden in the verse. Not merely to visit awareness occasionally, but to become so aligned with truth that fear no longer governs you, reaction no longer defines you, fragmentation no longer controls you, until one day the old self is simply not, and what remains is conscious alignment itself. Verse 25. And Methuselah lived 187 years and begat Lamech. Now the genealogy continues, but this time the name introduced is very important because it brings us back to a familiar name, Lamech. But this is not the same Lamech from Cain's line, and that distinction matters deeply. Two different Lamechs. Cain's Lamech represented escalation, retaliation, amplified ego, and justified reaction. Seth's line Lamech appears after restored awareness, humility, groundedness, elevated consciousness, embodiment, disciplined awareness, and sustained alignment. So this Lamech represents something entirely different. Methuselah represents awareness of long-term consequence, legacy consciousness, and understanding that actions shape the future. Lamech, the name carries the idea of strength, power, and deep inward wrestling. But within Seth's line, it points toward mature consciousness, confronting the final layers of human struggle before rest and renewal. This is profound because once awareness becomes sustained, aligned, and conscious of long-term impact, it eventually begins confronting the deepest unresolved layers within itself. This verse is saying, mature consciousness eventually reaches a stage of deep inner confrontation before true rest can emerge. Why this matters? Growth is not linear. Even awakened people eventually encounter deeper fears, deeper exhaustion, deeper questions, and deeper wrestling with life. But this stage is different from Cain's Lamech. Cain's line escalated reaction outwardly. Seth's line confronts inward transformation consciously. This verse is saying, conscious awareness of long-term consequence eventually leads to deep inner confrontation and preparation for a new stage of renewal. Career example, what this looks like. A mature professional may achieve success, become grounded, and lead consciously. But eventually, deeper questions emerge, such as what truly matters? Is this aligned with who I've become? What kind of legacy am I leaving? Methuselah produces Lamech. This becomes deep self-reflection, re-evaluation of purpose, and confronting burnout or misalignment honestly. Relationship example, what this looks like. A conscious person may communicate well, love intentionally, and become emotionally mature. But eventually, deeper relational truths surface. Methuselah produces Lamech. This may involve confronting hidden wounds, re-evaluating patterns, and asking deeper questions about intimacy, purpose, and emotional truth. Spiritual and everyday life example. What this looks like. Spiritually, a person may awaken, heal, and become disciplined and aligned. But eventually, consciousness reaches deeper layers of transformation. Methuselah produces Lamech. This becomes deep introspection, confronting subtle ego, and questioning remaining attachments and illusions. Practical example. A person begins realizing awareness is not only about peace, but also honesty, inner confrontation, and deeper surrender. This verse reveals mature consciousness eventually confronts deeper inner realities before renewal and rest emerge. So now we see, even after awakening, alignment, and sustained awareness, the journey continues deeper. Because true transformation eventually asks, what still remains unresolved within me? And this stage is sacred, not because it feels comfortable, but because it prepares consciousness for deeper renewal, deeper peace, and deeper integration. And now, the next verses will reveal something beautiful. What emerges after this deep inner confrontation? This is where the pattern begins moving toward rest, renewal, and a new beginning. Verse 26. And Methuselah lived after he begat Lamech 782 years and begat sons and daughters. Now the pattern continues unfolding. And this verse reveals something very important. Deep inner confrontation does not stop life. It transforms what life produces. Methuselah represents awareness of long-term consequence, legacy consciousness, and understanding impact over time. Lamech, set line, represents deep inner reflection, confronting remaining layers within, and mature consciousness wrestling honestly with itself. Now, after producing Lamech, Methuselah continues producing sons and daughters. This reveals mature awareness continues producing new expressions, even during deep inner transformation. Why this matters? Many people think struggle means failure, questioning means regression, deep reflection means they are lost. But Genesis reveals transformation often deepens through reflection and inner confrontation. Begat sons and daughters. Sons and daughters equals outcomes, expressions, and manifestations. So this means even in seasons of deep reflection, consciousness continues producing wisdom, maturity, discernment, and deeper authenticity. This verse is saying, even during deep inner confrontation and transformation, consciousness continues producing new growth and deeper awareness. Career example, what this looks like. A mature professional may begin re-evaluating purpose, questioning old ambitions, and reflecting deeply on meaning. Begat sons and daughters, and from that reflection emerges wiser leadership, healthier priorities, meaningful contribution, and deeper intentionality. Practical example, someone may leave toxic ambition behind and begin building work aligned with purpose and long-term impact. Relationship example, what this looks like. A conscious person may confront old emotional wounds, reevaluate relational patterns, and reflect deeply on love and connection. Begat sons and daughters. This produces emotional honesty, healthier boundaries, deeper intimacy, and more authentic connection. Practical example. Instead of repeating unconscious cycles, they begin consciously creating healthier relational dynamics. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person may go through deep questioning, inward wrestling, and periods of silence and reflection. Begat sons and daughters, yet even there, wisdom grows, awareness deepens, discernment sharpens, and consciousness matures. Practical example. A person realizes true spirituality is not avoiding inner confrontation, but allowing transformation to happen through it. The core revelation. This verse reveals deep reflection and inner transformation still produce growth, wisdom, and new expressions of awareness. Genesis 5 keeps showing consciousness continues unfolding even through difficult inner stages. Transformation is not instant, linear, and effortless. It unfolds gradually, deeply, and continuously. So now we see even seasons of questioning, reflection, and inner wrestling are still productive spiritually and consciously because growth is still happening underneath. Awareness is still unfolding. Consciousness is still evolving. And this is deeply comforting. You do not stop growing simply because you are in a difficult inner season. Sometimes the deepest wisdom, the deepest healing, and the deepest transformation emerges through honest reflection. So the question becomes, what might my current season of reflection be preparing me for? Because even in the deepest inner process, consciousness is still creating something new. Verse 27. And all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. Now we come to the longest lifespan recorded in Genesis 5, Methuselah. And symbolically, this is extremely important because Methuselah represents long-term consequence, legacy consciousness, and awareness of how life unfolds over time. Why Methuselah's years are so long? This is not random. The symbolism points toward the extended influence of consequence and legacy. Because nothing shapes life more deeply over time than repeated patterns, sustained awareness, and long-term choices. This verse is revealing awareness of consequence and legacy has far-reaching influence throughout life. And he died, again, not merely biological language, but completion of a stage. Why this matters here? Methuselah's stage represents becoming deeply conscious that actions matter, habits shape destiny, and awareness reproduces itself across time. But eventually, even this awareness must evolve further. The deeper meaning, a person can become highly reflective, deeply aware of consequence, and focus on long-term impact. But eventually, consciousness must move beyond even reflection into renewal, rest, and rebirth into a new state. This verse is saying, deep awareness of consequence and legacy has enduring influence. But even this stage eventually completes its cycle to prepare consciousness for renewal. Career example, what this looks like. A mature professional may spend years building impact, mentoring others, and thinking long term. But eventually, even their understanding of success evolves further. Practical example, at first, legacy may mean achievements and influence. Later, awareness deepens into meaning, peace, and fulfillment beyond productivity. One stage of purpose completes, so a deeper one can emerge. Relationship example, what this looks like. A person may become deeply aware of how patterns affect love, how trust is built over time, and how relationships shape life. But eventually, awareness deepens beyond analysis into presence, peace, and conscious companionship. Practical example. Instead of constantly analyzing the relationship, they begin simply embodying love and awareness naturally. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person may spend years reflecting deeply, studying, and becoming aware of patterns and consequences. But eventually, awareness moves beyond constant striving and reflection into restful embodiment, peaceful integration, and effortless alignment. Practical example. At first, spirituality may feel like intense seeking. Later, awareness becomes grounded, simple, and naturally integrated into being. This verse reveals even deep awareness of consequence and legacy eventually gives way to deeper peace and renewal. Genesis 5 keeps showing us every stage of consciousness unfolds, matures, completes its cycle, and prepares for deeper awareness. So now we see even the longest stage, deep reflection, legacy awareness, and understanding consequence was not the end. Because consciousness is always moving toward deeper simplicity, deeper peace, and deeper integration. And this is beautiful because it means transformation is not endless striving. Eventually, awareness settles, wisdom softens, and consciousness rests. So the invitation becomes learn from consequence, live consciously, and think long term, but also do not become trapped in endless inner striving, because every completed stage in Genesis 5 is preparing consciousness for deeper renewal and rest. Verse 28. And Lamech lived 182 years and begat a son. Now we arrive at a very important transition point, because this is Seth's line Lamech, not Cain's. And this Lamech appears after awareness, humility, grounding, embodiment, disciplined consciousness, sustained alignment, and legacy awareness. Why this matters? This means consciousness has already gone through deep development, and now something new is about to emerge. Quick reminder of set-line Lamech. This Lamech represents deep inner reflection, mature consciousness confronting itself honestly, and the final layers before renewal. And begat a son. Notice something important. The verse pauses before naming the son. That creates anticipation because symbolically, a new stage of consciousness is about to emerge. This verse is revealing, after deep inner reflection and mature awareness, consciousness becomes ready to birth renewal. Why this matters psychologically? Many people experience deep questioning, exhaustion with old patterns, and inward wrestling, and it feels like everything is falling apart. But often, a new level of awareness is about to be born. The pattern. This is the stage before rest, renewal, and a fresh beginning. This verse is saying, after deep reflection and mature awareness, consciousness reaches the threshold where a new and restorative state is ready to emerge. Career example. What this looks like. A person may go through burnout, re-evaluation, and questioning old ambitions. Begat a son, and from that process, a new sense of purpose emerges. Healthier priorities develop, and work becomes more aligned. Practical example. Someone realizes they no longer want success built on exhaustion and fear, and a new professional identity begins emerging. Relationship example, what this looks like. A person may go through deep emotional reflection, confronting relational wounds, and re-evaluating unhealthy patterns. Begat a son, and from that process, healthier love emerges, clearer boundaries develop, and conscious partnership becomes possible. Practical example. Instead of repeating old cycles, they begin intentionally creating relationships rooted in peace and awareness. Spiritual and everyday life example. What this looks like. Spiritually, a person may go through deep inner wrestling, questioning, and transformation. Begat a son, and eventually, a simpler awareness emerges. Deeper peace develops. Alignment becomes more natural. Practical example. A person realizes spirituality is no longer about striving, but about conscious, restful living. This verse reveals deep inner transformation prepares consciousness for renewal and new awareness. The deep pattern. Genesis 5 has been tracing awareness evolving, consciousness maturing, and alignment deepening. And now, something restorative is about to emerge. So now we see the deepest transformations often happen after exhaustion, after questioning, and after deep inner confrontation, because those moments prepare consciousness for something entirely new. And this is hopeful because if you are in a season of reflection, re-evaluation, and inner wrestling, It may not mean you are lost. It may mean a new awareness is preparing to emerge within you. And now, the next verse will reveal the name of this new state. And that name will change the entire direction of the narrative. Verse 29. And he called his name Noah, saying, This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord had cursed. Now we arrive at one of the most important transitions in Genesis 5. After fragmentation, reaction, escalation, awareness, humility, grounding, discipline, sustained alignment, and deep reflection, a new state finally emerges: Noah. The name Noah means rest, comfort, relief, or quieting. This is profound because after all the striving and inner wrestling, consciousness finally discovers rest. This same shall comfort us. Comfort here is not laziness or avoidance. It means relief from inner struggle, peace after fragmentation, and restoration after exhausting cycles. Concerning our work and toil, this is powerful psychologically. Remember, the ground represents consciousness or inner reality. The curse represents fragmented living, misalignment, or reactive existence. So toil symbolizes exhausting unconscious living. The deeper meaning, Lamech is saying, this new consciousness, Noah, will bring relief from the exhausting cycles created by fragmented awareness. Because of the ground which the Lord had cursed. Again, not arbitrary punishment, but the painful consequences of misaligned consciousness. The cursed ground is reactive living, internal fragmentation, emotional toil, and disconnected existence. Noah becomes the answer. Noah represents restful awareness, integrated consciousness, and inner peace after long transformation. This verse is saying, after long cycles of fragmented and exhausting consciousness, a new state of restful and integrated awareness emerges, bringing relief and inner peace. Career example, what this looks like. A person may spend years overworking, proving themselves, and living from anxiety and pressure. Then comes Noah. Eventually, they stop building identity only through productivity. They create healthier balance, and work becomes aligned instead of exhausting. Practical example, success no longer comes from fear, burnout, and validation seeking, but from grounded purpose and peace. Relationship example, what this looks like. A person may spend years repeating painful cycles, reacting emotionally, and struggling in unhealthy dynamics. Then comes Noah. Awareness deepens, and eventually, love becomes peaceful, communication becomes grounded, and relationships stop feeling like emotional warfare. Practical example. Instead of constant chaos and fear, they begin experiencing emotional safety and conscious connection. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person may spend years striving, seeking, and wrestling internally. Then comes Noah. Eventually, awareness settles. Spirituality becomes restful, Alignment becomes natural. Practical example. Instead of constantly chasing experiences, they begin living peacefully and consciously in ordinary life. The core revelation. This verse reveals the purpose of transformation is not endless striving, but integrated rest and conscious peace. The full journey of Genesis 5. Genesis 5 has traced consciousness through restoration, humility, grounding, elevation, embodiment, discipline, sustained awareness, reflection, consequence, and deep transformation. And now, rest emerges. Noah appears as rest after inner struggle, peace after fragmentation, and comfort after exhausting cycles. And this is deeply healing because many people are living emotionally exhausted, spiritually restless, and internally fragmented, trying to survive life through constant toil within. But Genesis reveals the journey of awareness is leading somewhere, not toward endless struggle, but toward peace, integration, and conscious rest. And this is why Noah matters so much, because Noah represents the moment consciousness stops fighting itself. So the question becomes, what would happen if I stopped building my life from inner struggle and began living from conscious peace instead? Because the deepest transformation eventually leads to rest. Verse 30. And Lamech lived after he begot Noah 595 years and begot sons and daughters. Now the pattern continues. And this verse reveals something beautiful. Once restful awareness emerges, life itself begins producing differently. Lamech's set line represents deep reflection, inner confrontation, and mature awareness wrestling honestly within. Noah represents rest, relief, integrated awareness, and peace after fragmentation. Now, after Noah emerges, Lamech continues producing sons and daughters. This is revealing. Once consciousness finds inner rest, healthier expressions begin multiplying naturally throughout life. Why this matters? Many people live from internal pressure, emotional exhaustion, and reactive striving, and unconsciously reproduce tension, instability, and conflict. But when awareness becomes restful, what it produces changes completely. Begat sons and daughters. Sons and daughters equals manifestations, outcomes, and expressions. So this means restful awareness now produces peace, emotional stability, grounded decisions, healthier relationships, and calm environments. This verse is saying, when consciousness becomes integrated and restful, it continuously produces healthier and more peaceful expressions through life. Career example, what this looks like. A person who once worked from fear, burnout, and proving themselves eventually finds inner grounding. Noah consciousness. Now they begin producing healthier work boundaries, calm leadership, purposeful productivity, and sustainable success. Practical example. Instead of creating stressful environments, they begin creating stability and trust around them. Relationship example, what this looks like. A person who once lived emotionally reactive, anxious, and fearful in relationships eventually finds inner peace. Knower consciousness. This produces emotional safety, calmer communication, conscious connection, and stability in love. Practical example. Instead of constant emotional chaos, they begin responding from peace and understanding. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person moves from endless seeking, inner striving, and fear-based spirituality into restful awareness. Knower consciousness. This produces peace in daily living, grounded presence, clarity, and conscious simplicity. Practical example. Instead of constantly searching outside themselves, they begin living from inner alignment naturally. The core revelation. This verse reveals restful consciousness naturally reproduces peace and stability throughout life. The deep pattern. Genesis 5 has been moving consciousness toward restoration, humility, grounding, embodiment, discipline, sustained awareness, reflection, and finally, rest. And now, that rest begins shaping life itself. So now we see peace is not passive, rest is not weakness. True rest is integrated awareness. Consciousness no longer fighting itself, and inner alignment becoming natural. And when consciousness becomes restful, everything it produces begins changing too. Because peaceful awareness creates peaceful environments. Grounded consciousness creates grounded relationships. Integrated living creates stability. So the question becomes, what kind of life would emerge if my inner world truly became restful? Because the deepest healing eventually transforms everything flowing out of you. Verse 31. And all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. Now we reach a very symbolic number, 777, 777. And this is not random, because throughout scripture, 7 symbolizes completion, fullness, and spiritual maturity. So 777 represents intensified completion, fullness brought to maturity, and the completion of an entire cycle. Quick reminder of Seth's line Lamech. This Lamech represents deep reflection, inner wrestling, mature confrontation with self, and preparation for rest and renewal. And from this stage came Noah, which is restful consciousness. Now we see 777. This is powerful because the stage of deep inner confrontation has now fully completed its purpose. This verse is revealing consciousness has completed a full cycle of inner transformation and is now ready for a completely new stage. Why this matters? Before true rest emerges, there is often deep reflection, confronting hidden patterns, inner wrestling, and re-evaluating identity and purpose. And this process feels long, exhausting, and intense, But Genesis reveals it has a purpose. And he died, again, not merely biological language, but completion of a consciousness stage. This means the stage of deep inner struggle has now finished its cycle. This verse is saying, after a complete cycle of deep inner confrontation and transformation, consciousness completes its process and prepares fully for renewal and rest. Career example, what this looks like. A person may go through years of burnout, striving, re-evaluating purpose, and confronting unhealthy ambition. 777. Eventually, the old success-driven identity fully dissolves, and something healthier emerges. Purposeful work, sustainable balance, and meaningful contribution. Practical example, they stop building identity through constant achievement and begin living from clarity and peace instead. Relationship example, what this looks like. A person may go through painful relational cycles, emotional reflection, and confronting attachment wounds. 777. Eventually, the old reactive relational identity completes its cycle, and healthier love, conscious communication, and emotional peace begin emerging naturally from the old reactive self, 666, to the conscious self, 777. Incompleteness to completeness. Practical example. Instead of repeating emotional chaos, they begin relating from grounded awareness consistently. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, a person may spend years searching, striving, questioning, and wrestling internally. 777. Eventually, something settles deeply within. Practical example, the need to constantly prove spirituality, endlessly chase experiences, and seek external validation begins dissolving, and awareness becomes peaceful, integrated, and restful. The core revelation. This verse reveals deep inner transformation eventually reaches completion and gives way to peaceful integration. The full arc of Genesis 5. Genesis 5 has traced awareness restored, humility developed, grounding established, consciousness elevated, awareness embodied, discipline formed, alignment sustained, deep reflection endured, restful awareness emerging, and now the old cycle fully completes. So now we see the number 777 is not random. It represents completion, fulfillment, and transformation brought to maturity. And this is deeply comforting because it means inner struggle is not endless. There comes a point where the old identity dissolves. The old striving completes its cycle. Consciousness finally settles into peace. And this is the beauty of the journey, not endless suffering, but transformation leading toward integration and rest. So the question becomes, what cycle within me is finally reaching completion? Because sometimes what feels like the end of you is actually the completion of an old consciousness preparing you for renewal. Genesis 5:32. And Noah was 500 years old. And Noah begot Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now Genesis 5 ends with something very important. Not one son, three. And symbolically, this matters deeply because Noah represents rest, integrated consciousness, and peace after fragmentation. So now the question becomes, what does restful consciousness produce? Why three sons matter? Throughout scripture, the number three often symbolizes completeness, full expression, and multi-dimensional manifestation. So this is showing integrated awareness now begins expressing itself in multiple dimensions of life. The meaning of the names. Shem means name, reputation, identity, and character. Shem represents conscious identity aligned with truth. Ham means warm, passionate, earthly, and emotional vitality. Ham represents emotional energy and embodied human experience. Japheth means enlargement, expansion, and openness. Japheth represents expansion of consciousness and increased awareness. Putting it together, from restful consciousness, Noah, emerged Shem, aligned identity, Ham, embodied emotional vitality, and Japheth, expanded awareness. This is beautiful because it reveals when consciousness becomes integrated and restful, it begins expressing itself through identity, emotional vitality, and expanded awareness simultaneously. This verse is saying, restful and integrated consciousness produces a complete and expanded human experience expressed through aligned identity, emotional embodiment, and enlarged awareness. Career example, what this looks like. A person who finds inner rest begins developing Shem, confidence rooted in identity instead of titles. Ham, passion and emotional engagement with work. And Japheth, expanded creativity, vision, and growth. Practical example. Instead of working from survival, they begin working from purpose, grounded passion, and visionary thinking. Relationship example, what this looks like. Integrated consciousness begins producing Shem, healthy self-worth. Ham, emotional presence and warmth. And Japheth, openness, growth, and deeper connection. Practical example, a person becomes capable of loving consciously without losing themselves emotionally. Spiritual and everyday life example, what this looks like. Spiritually, integrated awareness produces clear identity, healthy emotional expression, and expanded understanding of life. Practical example, instead of fragmented spirituality, awareness becomes balanced, embodied, and expansive. The core revelation. This verse reveals restful consciousness produces balanced and expanded expressions of human awareness. The completion of Genesis 5. Genesis 5 began with, in the likeness of God made he him. and ends with integrated consciousness producing expanded expressions of life. This entire chapter traces the evolution of awareness, the transformation of consciousness, and the journey from fragmentation toward integrated rest. So now, we've walked through Genesis 5 together, and what once looked like a list of impossible ages, repetitive names, and mysterious genealogies has revealed itself to be a map of evolving consciousness, a journey of inner transformation, and the progression of awareness within the human experience. We saw awareness restored through Seth, humility through Enosh, grounded identity through Canaan, elevated awareness through Mahalalel, embodiment through Jared, disciplined alignment through Enoch, legacy consciousness through Methuselah, deep inner reflection through Lamech, and finally, rest through Noah. And sadly, Genesis 5 stops being about how long did they physically live and becomes about how consciousness evolves, how awareness matures, and how identity transforms through cycles. And this is why the chapter keeps repeating, and he died. Because scripture is showing us every stage of awareness eventually passes. Every identity completes its cycle. Every level of consciousness evolves into something deeper. This is exactly what Paul meant when he said, I die daily. Not physical death, but old identities dissolving, unconscious patterns fading, and fragmented awareness giving way to deeper alignment. And suddenly, Jesus' words become clearer too. He said, in my Father's house are many mansions. Most were taught to think physical mansions somewhere after death. But Jesus already said, the kingdom of God is within you. And Paul said, you are the temple of God. So the Father's house is consciousness itself, the inner dwelling place of awareness. And the many mansions are stages of consciousness, levels of awareness, and evolving states of being. Genesis 5 is literally showing us the journey through those mansions, from fragmentation to reaction to ego to striving toward alignment, integration, and conscious rest. And this is why Paul speaks about being caught up into the seventh heaven. Because in scripture, 7 represents completion, fullness, and mature alignment. And heaven is within. So the seventh heaven symbolically becomes complete awareness, integrated consciousness, and wholeness within. And now the Bible becomes coherent. Genesis 5, Jesus and Paul are all speaking one language. The evolution of consciousness, the transformation of identity, and the journey from fragmentation into wholeness. So the next time you read Genesis 5, don't just count years. Watch the progression. Watch consciousness evolving. Watch awareness unfolding through stages. Watch the old self continually die so a deeper self can emerge. Because this chapter is ultimately revealing something beautiful. You are not stuck. Consciousness can evolve. Awareness can deepen. Fragmented identity can heal until eventually, like Noah, the inner world finds rest. And like Enoch, consciousness was continually in alignment until finally, the fragmented self is not anymore. And what remains is integrated awareness, complete consciousness, and the kingdom within fully awakened. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next teaching. Have a good night.